My name is Ren Okafor, and I spent 11 years mapping rocks nobody wanted, which is how I ended up standing on a moon with no name worth remembering, in a suit that smelled like recycled coffee, staring at a pillar that had made fools of better people than me. The survey contract called it Site 14. The literature called it dead. Every linguist who'd flown out here in the last 30 years had walked away from that Stele with nothing but a headache and a grant proposal for next year's funding. It stood alone on the regolith plain, twice my height, carved top to base in a spiral script nobody could read, under a sky the color of a bruise healing. No structure around it, no wall, no temple, no reason. Just the stone and the silence, and the two moons of the gas giant hanging low and huge on the horizon, throwing long violet shadows across the dust. My team lead, Halvard, had already given up on it for the day. He and Priya were 40 meters back at the rover, arguing with orbital control about a sensor glitch, their voices tinny and far away in my helmet feed. I wasn't supposed to be this close to the Stele alone. I was supposed to be finishing the topographic sweep, logging elevation and mineral composition, and nothing more. The same dull work I'd done on 11 other rocks that had never once talked back. But something about the thing kept pulling my eyes back to it every time I turned the scanner its way, the way a word on the tip of your tongue keeps pulling at you even after you've stopped trying to remember it. I'd read the survey history the night before, an old habit, careful, and a little superstitious. 3 decades of teams had come and gone from Site 14. Linguists with better degrees than mine, cultural pattern algorithms trained on 40 dead languages, one exasperated professor who'd spent a full season convinced the grooves were nothing but erosion and left in a temper. All of them had touched the stone at some point, pressed a palm flat against it, run gloved fingers over the carving the way you'd feel for a pulse. All of them had walked away with nothing, and I had no particular reason to think I'd fare any better. I walked up to it. Nobody told me to. Nobody told me not to. Up close, the carving wasn't random. That was the first thing that struck me, standing there with dust settling on my visor. Every linguist who'd studied it called the pattern chaotic, decorative, a dead end. But it wasn't chaotic. It was a spiral of long and short grooves, deep and shallow, curling from the base of the stone up toward a wide, flat crown, and something in the shape of it snagged at a memory so old I almost didn't trust it. My grandmother used to keep string. Not decoration, function. She was a farmer on a colony world where the growing season ran by starlight instead of a calendar, because the local sun did strange things to the soil and you couldn't trust a clock to tell you when to plant. She'd tie knots in a length of cord, long knot, short knot, long knot, mapping the rise and fall of 3 particular stars against the horizon, and she taught me to read it with my fingers, before I could read words on a page. "Close your eyes," she used to say. "Your hands remember longer than your head does." I used to sit on the porch step with that cord in my lap, while she called out star names I couldn't see yet, until the pattern stopped being a puzzle and became something my hand already knew, the way you know your own kitchen in the dark. I hadn't thought about that cord in 15 years. Not since the funeral where nobody else in the family understood why I asked to keep the string instead of anything worth actual money. I don't know why I did what I did next. I've told this part before, since, more times than I can count, and I've never had an answer that satisfied anyone, including me. I reached out with 2 fingers, the way she'd taught me, and I traced the spiral the way I would have traced her knotted cord. Long groove, pause, short groove, pause, following the rhythm instead of trying to read the shape. The stone was warm. I registered that before anything else, before the light, before the sound. Warm, under my gloved fingers, on a moon where the surface temperature hadn't cracked freezing in longer than my instruments could measure. I should have pulled back, I didn't. The grooves lit from beneath my fingertips, a thread of pale gold crawling up the spiral, in the exact rhythm of my hand, like the stone was following me, instead of the other way around. It reached the crown of the pillar, and the whole flat top of it split open along a seam so fine it hadn't shown on any scan, any survey, any 30 years of patient failed study, and folded outward like a flower deciding, after all this time, that it was finally worth the trouble of blooming. Behind me I heard Halvard shouting my name, heard boots hitting regolith at a dead run, heard Priya's voice cracking through the comm channel asking what I'd done, what I'd touched, what in God's name was happening to Site 14. I didn't answer. I couldn't have found the words if I'd tried. Inside the opened crown was a second face of stone, smooth where the outer carving had been rough, and on it a single figure resolved itself out of light the color of a struck match, a woman standing with her hand raised, not in greeting, but in the exact gesture I still had frozen in the air in front of me, 2 fingers extended, tracing nothing now but afterglow. The voice that came wasn't a voice so much as a weight settling into the air around me, into my chest, into the marrow of my arms. Star-marked blood, rise, Queen. I stood there long enough that Halvard reached me and grabbed my shoulder hard enough to spin me half around, and I remember his face through both our visors, stricken and pale, and I remember not being able to tell him anything except that the stone was warm, and it had said something, and I didn't understand it yet, even though some old unlit part of me already did. They tell me, later, the specialists who came after, the ones with better instruments and worse patients than mine, that the spiral wasn't a script at all. It was a star chart, disguised as decoration for 10,000 years, so that only a hand, that already knew the rhythm of it, that had learned to read stars through touch instead of sight, could ever wake it. Every scholar who came to Site 14 had tried to read the grooves with their eyes and their theories and their translation software, and the stone had simply waited, patient as stone is, for someone who would read it the way my grandmother had taught 3 generations of tired farmers to read the sky with their fingers, because the light lied and the stars didn't. Halvard asked me, once we were back aboard and his hands had finally stopped shaking, how I'd known to touch it that way, instead of any of the 50 other ways a person could run a finger over a carving. I didn't have a clean answer then, and I still don't. The truest thing I can say is that my hands remembered before I did, and that whatever waited inside that stone had been patient enough to outlast every clever theory sent against it, waiting instead for something as plain as a farmer's habit passed down through people who never once thought of themselves as carrying anything sacred. I am not a queen of anything. I want to say that plainly, because it's the part people always skip past when they tell this story back to me, eyes bright, waiting for me to claim a throne I've never seen, and a bloodline I can't feel in my body any more than I could yesterday. Whatever the Stele saw in my hands, in the pattern I didn't know I was carrying, it wasn't royalty. It was inheritance of a much smaller, much stranger kind. The kind that gets passed down in string and calluses and patient repetition, generation to generation, long after anyone remembers what it was originally for. But the stone remembered. It had been standing on that dead moon since before my grandmother's grandmother's grandmother learned to tie her first knot, waiting for the rhythm to come walking across the regolith in a borrowed survey suit, smelling like recycled coffee, thinking about nothing more than finishing a topographic sweep before shift change. I go back there sometimes, when the contract allows it. I sit near the open crown, in the daylight that never quite warms the plane, and I put my fingers against the second face of stone, and I don't trace anything anymore. I just let my hand rest there, the way you'd rest a hand on the shoulder of someone very old, who has been waiting a very long time for you to arrive, and who is, at last, no longer waiting. The weight in the air never comes back exactly the same way twice, but it never quite leaves either. I carry it now the way I carry the string my grandmother left me, coiled in a drawer I haven't opened in years, not because I understand what I'm holding, but because some things choose you long before you're ready to be chosen, and all that's left after that is to stand up straight and answer to the name.